Hey guys, I am really excited to talk about Virginia Woolf today. And I really hope everybody's doing well during this quarantine and everybody's staying safe and has a really great weekend since it is Easter weekend and stuff like that. But yeah, let's go ahead and talk about Virginia Woolf already. So Virginia Woolf was born in 1882 to an upper middle class family, and she passed away in 1941 when she committed suicide, which I'll get into a little bit more. But you should know early on that she had a lot of struggles with mental illness growing up, and a lot of people just thought she was mad, but even though there wasn't a specific diagnosis at the time, what a lot of people believe she had is what we would call bipolar disorder, and that affected her pretty heavily throughout her life and eventually was the cause of her suicide. So something that you should know about Virginia Woolf, that she kind of coined, this idea of feminist criticism. That started with A Room of One's Own, and as you saw from the source that Dr. Pond provided for us for the Engage activity, that was really what she was known for. She was a really strong advocate for women's rights, the equality of women and women in literature in specific. She really found it important that women were represented within literature because she found that gender was something that just was a really big issue at the time. And she was one of the few writers at the time who actually labeled herself as a feminist, because even though there were writers who were female who considered themselves feminists, they stayed away from labeling themselves as such, which was really weird. But yeah, she was a really strong advocate of women's rights and was ahead of her time when it came to feminism during, the early 20th century. So something that we can talk about regarding that idea, feminism and stuff like that, was she grew up in a family where her mother was very strongly anti-feminist and her dad also was pretty anti-feminist. She didn't go to college because her parents believed that only boys were worth going to college or worth spending the money on for college, so she was kind of denied that access. However, she did grow up in a pretty good home and upper middle class, and so she had a pretty large library that her dad had that exposed her to a lot of great writers that we've got to read, like Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Mary Shelley, people like that. So female writers were really important to her, and they really inspired her writing that she eventually became famous for. So that's really interesting. Another thing that we should address is that she was married to a man named Leonard Woolf, who was a very distinguished man himself and was very important in her life. But Virginia was also bisexual, which was, new at the time, where not many people were out about being bisexual or homosexual at the time, but Virginia Woolf was, and that'll come up really important within the literary networks that she actually created. Now, in specific to the Brownings, so Virginia Woolf was born after the Brownings were actually around, and so she doesn't have a direct connection with the Brownings. She didn't have a first-hand correspondence with the Brownings. However, her aunt, Julia Margaret Cameron, was actually a very famous photographer during the 19th century, and she actually took photographs of Robert Browning, and that's the connection that she has, because her great aunt took pictures of Robert Browning, and these photographs were actually published within the Hogarth Press, which is a publishing company that Virginia and her husband Leonard started together later on in their lives. But there's actually a letter that Robert Browning wrote to her great aunt regarding those pictures, and he's basically just thanking her for them and saying how wonderful they are and whatnot. And you can actually see the picture that she took on the handout that I provided, and the letter that he wrote to her regarding the picture. So that's the connection that she has to the Brownings. But in addition to that, she also wrote a novel She also wrote a book called Flush, which is really interesting. It's an imaginative story. It's kind of fiction and nonfiction about Elizabeth Barrett Browning's dog, which was a Cocker Spaniel, and the whole book is based on the dog. So I guess that's like another connection that she has, although it's not firsthand. So some other literary, networks that she had were, actually she had a lot. Because she had that publishing company, she was able to publish works of pretty famous people that we know today, including T.S. Eliot, which is, we just read T.S. Eliot, so that's really, really great. But also a female author that she also published was Catherine Mansfield, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, and she didn't really have a great relationship with Catherine Mansfield, who was also bisexual, but she did publish her through their publishing company. She also had a really good relationship with Anne Thackeray, and Anne Thackeray is a author that maybe we're not isn't super well known, but her father, William Thackeray, actually wrote that satirical piece called Vanity Fair, which is pretty famous. And so she actually knew Anne Thackeray really, really well because she was her step-aunt. But something that you'll see with Virginia Woolf was that she always tried to inspire and also tried to advocate and help the women around her, mainly in the literary field, but also within other fields like art and composition. And you can see those examples with letters that she wrote to Ethel Smith, a composer, and Vida Sackville West, who was an author who wrote a very famous poem called The Land. Now, Vida Sackville West and Virginia Woolf started off as, professional writers who got to know each other throughout the field, making those networks. But their relationship grew into something romantic, and she actually had an affair with Vida that eventually ended, but they still remained friends. But she always tried to encourage Vida to write more and more because The Land was so successful. And you kind of see that pattern with Virginia Woolf and the other women in her life, how she was constantly trying to encourage them and advance their careers, which I thought was really, really cool because it kind of, she wasn't just, talking about feminism and talking about equal rights, but she was being proactive in doing so. So I thought that was really interesting. Another relationship that I thought I'd mention, because I just found an entire book about letters that she sent to this man, is Lytton Strachey. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. But he's actually a famous author and critic who, kind of launched this new idea of biography, and it's very specific to, his line of work. He was a founder of the Bloomsbury Group, which is a group that both Leonard and Virginia were a part of, which was just this group that had a strong association with Cambridge University. And it really focused on, the arts and things like that. They were really strong advocates of the arts at the time. And this man was a really, really close friend of Virginia Woolf, so strong that she actually based 2 characters off of him in her books, The Waves and The Voyage Out. If you see me looking this way, it's because I have my notes in front of me. But she based 2 of her characters off of him, and she has hundreds of letters to this man who was just a really big influence in her life and obviously on her work, since she decided to base characters off of him. She even has letters to other people talking about him and his death, because he eventually died of stomach cancer. But he was also really important in her life and was within the literary field as well, so that was really cool to kind of find out. Also with Vida, how strong of an influence she had on her life, she also based a character in her novel Orlando, a biography, that's the title, off of Vida. So these 2 people really important in her life and really meant a lot to her, enough for her to, base characters off of them in her novels. So yeah, I think things to really take away from Virginia Woolf is, she was a really strong feminist and she was ahead of her time when it came to feminism. She sparked the idea of feminist criticism with A Room of One's Own, which we're currently reading. That was the first piece to ever be called feminist criticism. It didn't exist before that piece, so she really did start it off. She was a strong advocate of women in literature and really tried to help people and tried to help women in literature to advance their careers. and she had very strong connections with people in the literary world, and some of the people that she also spoke to and published through her publishing company were E.M. Foster, T.S. Eliot, as I already mentioned, and she also published translations of works by Sigmund Freud through the Hogarth Press, and that was the first time that they had ever been translated or published in English, works by Sigmund Freud. So that's a pretty big deal. But yeah, I hope you guys loved A Room of One's Own, and I hope that if you have any questions or anything like that, that you are comfortable asking me. Thanks.